What's up, fucker? It's your boy Jack Slack, checking in for a short one today. I thought, let's be honest, this Saturdays, whatever it is, the UFC card this weekend is absolutely dire. I was looking down the card to see that, like the other week, there was a card that wasn't so stellar, but there were a couple of guys on it who were interesting, and I could talk about them. And I put together that little Filthy Casuals quickie on Austin Hubbard, and completely overlooked Joe Selecki. But there's normally stuff like that on a card, whereas this card is pretty. I'm not going to say what you see is what you get, because there can still be good fights, but there's not an awful lot to get hype about. There's not an awful lot of known commodities I can do interesting stuff on. I mean, there's Carlos Condit on the undercard, but he's so long in the tooth at this point. I think he's 2-8 in his last 10. And even then, Thiago Alves was lighting him up in one of his wins. Though he did beat Robbie Lawler for the title, which is a weird little thing to have on that record. But yeah, just a reminder that these drop-offs can be hard and they're unrelenting a lot of the time. Which I suppose links in with like Chris Weidman coming out this week and saying that he's the worst matchup for Israel Adesanya. And, a lot of people just laughed at him, and you could easily laugh at him because obviously nothing he's done lately suggests that he'd be any difficulty for someone on Izzy's level. But that's just how these guys think. Like, Chris Weidman at his best was phenomenal. I would give him a great chance against Israel Adesanya at his best, because he had some really interesting skills that matched up interestingly with current, well, I presume we're in Israel Adesanya's prime, but current prime Adesanya's skills. For a start, Chris Weidman actually very good at cutting the cage and using it to create takedowns. But no, like his drop-off was so hard. There are people who think USADA instantly, but he took an awful lot of damage in that Rockhold fight. Rockhold had a similar sort of drop-off just a little bit later. So, did USADA kick in 6 months later for Rockhold? Or another one I think about is Barao versus Dillashaw. Everyone goes Barao or USADA got him, but Dillashaw was using for however long before getting caught under USADA. But anyway, yes, this card is pretty garbage. I tried to watch some of, I think it's Irene, not Irene. Well, I tried to watch some of Aldana's fights. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that she brings some fun sometimes for a women's bantamweight, but mainly it's like watching someone try and do Mike Tyson's stance but get punched in the head every time. Like, she moves her head, then she stops because she's about to attack, and that's when she gets jabbed in the face. But decent left hook, decent body shots sometimes. But yeah, nothing I'm going to write home about or get excited about or write a Patreon boy piece about or anything like that. So I thought, why don't we do something different? And I remembered I saw a tweet from my boy Michael, either Fiedel or Fidel, but he's just started a new site called MMA Prospects. Follow him on Twitter. Great guy, always looking at people who are coming up outside the UFC. In this podcast, we get caught up talking about the UFC because there's an event almost every week, and Bellator because I try to do a little bit more fairness, and of course, it's just funny. It's a funny fucking promotion. But there are a lot of guys outside the UFC, and particularly in those richest divisions. We're talking maybe featherweight to middleweight, not so much middleweight, featherweight to welterweight. Really deep talent pools worldwide, and Michael tweeted this, he tweeted one about welterweights earlier, but then he tweeted this lightweight one I thought was really good. He said, who would win in an around-the-world lightweight Grand Prix? ACA's Abdul Aziz, Abdulvakabov. Get used to me saying that name wrong, because I'm going to say it several times during this podcast. Matthias Gamrot, who was KSW's champion, has just signed with the UFC. Mason Jones, who's the lightweight and welterweight Cage Warriors champion now. You remember I mentioned him briefly in the last podcast because he won the welterweight title at the weekend. Braves' Clayton Silva, Rizin's Tafik Musayev, One's Martin Wynn, and PFL's Natan Schultz. And of course, the hypothetical matchups, I try not to get into them, though sometimes it is fun to get into them. I wrote, I feel like I wrote 2 at Fightland, but I definitely wrote Tyson versus Ali, and that was, obviously huge traffic for Fightland or Vice Sports, wherever I wrote it. But it was also quite a fun thought exercise, especially when you start talking about fighters like Ali who learned and changed over their careers. Because I think Cassius Clay, I'm saying that just to differentiate the eras, not because I'm like, his mother called him Cassius and I, 60 years on, I'm going to call him Cassius too. But to differentiate the eras, if you see the footage of Cassius Clay in the Golden Gloves, he is blisteringly fast, like unbelievably quick. And of course, coming up, those fights with like Brian London where he lands 12 punches in 2 seconds or whatever it is. But when he's very, very, very fast, but not quite the savvy ring general and strategist that he was later in life. Because, a lot of people believed that Ali was just always fast. They're like, oh, well, he went to the ropes against George Foreman, but he probably could have still outboxed him. Like, no, he didn't. Ali put a lot of time into slowing dudes down. And then what he did was he could put on bursts of speed through a round or two, and then take another round off, leaning on the ropes, letting the guy hit his elbows. It was very clever like that. And sometimes it resulted in some pretty boring fights, like the Oscar Bonavena one. But that was a little bit close to his exile. But certainly later on, he definitely started relying on holding more, and the single collar tie and one hand like inside control on the biceps. And guys really struggled with that, especially like Joe Frazier. And then I saw Larry Holmes versus Mike Tyson. Obviously, Holmes was ancient by the time that he fought Tyson. But in the first 2 or 3 rounds, he's able to tie Tyson up on the inside like that. And Tyson just looks really annoyed by it. And that's really interesting to consider. Like, that would be more annoying for Tyson probably than a young Cassius Clay flicking out jabs and trying to run. But anyway, back to the lightweight tournament worldwide. I won't do the matchups here, but I did take the chance to go and catch myself up a bit on some of these lads. Now, ACA, to be fair, a number of these are pretty easy to get on YouTube. ACA is formerly ACB, which I think we used to talk about a fair bit, because they were getting big for a while, and then it was very obvious that they were like they were Kadyrov adjacent and also a money laundering scheme. But to be fair, and Fight Nights Global too. Every Russian organisation is a money laundering. Almost every fighting organisation is a money laundering scheme. I was trying to sell my accountant friend on that the other day. I was going like, you should go into fight promotion. But you can get ACA fights online on YouTube. Cage Warriors is on Fight Pass. One is all on YouTube. They're doing great with that. PFL, again, all on YouTube. KSW, a lot of their stuff's on YouTube. They just sort of pick and choose what they put up, but there's some of Gamrot's stuff on there, including the great fight with Mansour Barnoui, who is not on this list, despite being the road champion. But we'll talk about him here anyway, because it's my house, my rules. Get fucked, mate. This was going to be a podcast about these 8 guys, but fuck these schlubs. We're talking about Mansour Barnoui now. Honestly, the hardest guy on this list to track down footage of is definitely Brave's Clayton Silva. Couple of fights up on YouTube. Tried looking on like Dailymotion and Vimeo and stuff. Not an awful lot there. Normally, Dailymotion will save you if you're trying to look for an old fight of someone that you think should be on YouTube but isn't. But to be honest, Brave's operation seems considerably smaller and more local than a lot of these ones. One's MMA side is not what it used to be, but like One, Rising, PFL, ACA, Cage Warriors even, actually KSW, all those much bigger organisations than Brave. Clayton Silva seems interesting, but he's fought a couple of guys on it. Well, he's certainly the guys on his record have very mixed records, so I was a little bit cautious going in. But from what I have seen of him, he's just quite awkward. He's a 6'2" lightweight, and I think that's what's interesting about the lightweight. Well, I was saying the real depth of talent is from featherweight to sort of middleweight, maybe welterweight normally. Because once you get into middleweight, you're talking about big lads. There are middleweights who are under 6 foot, but they tend to be on the chunky or muscly side. And with anything, once you get in towards the bigger lads, if they have athletic potential, they're probably in something else already. So normally sort of like featherweight to middleweight you're gonna get your 5'6" to your like 6'4". So normally where most of the talent is. But Clayton Silva being a 6'2" lightweight is pretty absurdly gangly. And what I saw of him was just kind of messy, like lots of wild kicks, letting guys drop on his hips and just sort of trying to fight them off. He looked a bit like a throwback fighter, to be honest. I mean, well worth your time to look up. In this one, I saw him like sprawl on a guy, and I think the guy broke his nose on the mat instead of in the punching exchange, where he just started bleeding everywhere. But yeah, I mean, worth a watch, but probably not on the level of some of these other lads. He apparently has a really big following in Brazil, though, which is, maybe it's because he has the same name as a footballer. But no, I was very surprised because looking down his record, he's actually been around forever. Had his first fight in 2011, and he's 34 years old. So I think that kind of takes you out like prospect territory and into you might have missed your chance territory. But yeah, I thought worth just mentioning there because he was part of the lineup of this tournament. But the one I was watching today was Natan Schultz, who, interesting story. I found out about Natan Schultz because I wasn't watching PFL. I just liked laughing about them because they were like World Series of Fighting, but rebranded because the money went weird. But they did that. Do you remember they did an event on New Year's Eve at Madison Square Garden? I presume the theatre part on top. I remember saying at the time, like, oh, what's the one night of the year that everyone is going to be doing something else? You know, like, even if you're the biggest MMA fan in the world, like alternate MMA fan in the world, you probably have either friends or a significant other who's going to make you go somewhere else. So they did disastrously at that event, and then they quickly rebranded as PFL. But now they're doing really well, apparently. They've had an injection of, like, new capital. They're doing $1 million prize for each of their tournaments. And the one guy... Well, two guys have won 2 tournaments that I can remember. One of them is Natan Schultz, and one of them is Lance Palmer. Now, I saw an interesting video from, I think it was one of the boys at the fight site, which was about Natan Schultz. And it came up, and I clicked on it, and I was like, oh, this guy's well interesting. And then I forgot about it for a little while. And then I came back, and I was like, oh, yeah, that guy who won 2 tournaments in PFL. Looked him up, found Lance Palmer, watched the Lance Palmer fight that was 5 rounds of him laying on a dude, and I went, that must have been an abnormal fight for Lance Palmer. And then I looked at this next fight, more of the same, until I realised I'd got the wrong guy in the wrong fucking division. And I've hated the fight site lads ever since. So then I found Natan Schultz, and thank God he's actually well interesting. In fact, as I'm recording this, I put up a little clip of him entering the deep half against Ahmed Aliyev. And if you remember, I did a couple of prospect watch pieces back at the Fight Primer when I was just starting it. And Ahmed Aliyev made it to the US, won a couple of fights in PFL, met Natan Schultz, I believe, in the tournament semi-final in 2019. And Schultz manhandled him. It was absolutely brilliant. But it was a back and forth fight, but Schultz, finished him in the second round and didn't really get hurt much in the process. But there's some back and forth throws in that fight, and Aliyev throws him at one point, gets put back into guard, stands over Schultz, and just as he's throwing his left hand, I think he's leading with his right leg, and he throws his left hand at Schultz's head, and Schultz just kicks him overhead, enters the deep half, swings underneath him, turns to his knees, comes up with the leg, with the head on the outside for the high crotch or head outside single, and then does the inside reap on the standing leg that Daniel Cormier does to end up in the guy's closed guard. Absolutely beautiful. And that's just like, there's always been this argument over whether deep half is viable in MMA. But I think the more you learn about deep half, the more you find that people's interpretation of deep half is different. Like, I've seen people who have caught, and when I say people, I mean like top level black belts who will teach like the Y sweep that we talked about the other day, where the leg that's on your shoulder is extended and you've got your knee inside the opponent's other knee, which is like a modified X guard. But they consider that deep half. Jeff Glover does like a deep half while the opponent's knee is on the floor, rather than Ryan Hall in that classic set from 2000 or whatever it was. He was all about extending the leg and making a lever out of it, whereas Jeff Glover's new stuff is all about just pulling their knee to the floor and building up and letting them fall off the top of you or sneaking out the back door. You got guys like Hani Yahya and Fabricio Verdum did it against Gustafsson, who will shoot the head outside single high crotch and then sit down into the deep half. And really then the deep half is, I think a lot of people think of the deep half as like that position with the leg extended and then you're going either backward or forward. But really the deep half is just getting underneath the guy and trying to come out the back door, and then if he stops you coming out the back door, you sweep him back the other way. It's a momentary thing. And I think where people get caught up is the entries too. Like, I've seen so many guys in MMA go from traditional half guard or knee shield half guard. They get the underhook on the waist, with on the side that they've got the leg trapped, and then you've seen this hundreds of times before. They dig their other arm underneath the opponent's thigh and they pull it towards them. And what will happen is the guy will Shogun versus John Jones was just full of this. But the other guy will just put his weight back and elbow you in the head. And if he's got his, if you've got your gloved hand stuck behind his thigh and he's kneeling on it, you're not getting it back. Pequeño, what's his name? The original best featherweight in the world when he met young Jose Aldo in WEC, got caught in the same position. But in that fight with Aliev, Schultz uses it beautifully. But anyway, back to Natan Schultz's style generally. What I really like about him, shades of Aldo. Hold on, don't get mad. In that he fights very tall. If you watch Jose Aldo, he tends to stand quite tall and a little bit squarer. He uses his boxing more nowadays, but even back in the day, he was very short stance because he liked to bring up knees and kick a lot. If you watch a lot of strikers in MMA, they tend to fight lower or fight more evasively, whereas Aldo was quite high and forward moving, which is not typically a combination that you would associate with good takedown defense. But he had these great hips, and certainly his ability to hip into guys and turn away and feed them the single when they shot on a double. Really, that was pretty much game breaking. If you watch the number of good wrestlers that Aldo fought, and he goes at them quite high in his stance and quite square, and they'll drop in on his hips and he'll just bump his hips into them, turn side on, throw in the whizzer or the overhook or whatever you want to call it, and feed them the single, and then he'll just push them down that leg. And Schultz fights very high, so I can only assume that he's very comfortable with his hips stopping takedowns, because you're losing your underhooks, you're losing your first line of defense in MMA. That's why so many fighters who are very comfortable boxing will fight with their lead hand low, like Robert Whittaker used to do it when he was a welterweight. Junior Dos Santos, they have that lead hand there so that it can just pick up the underhook if you shoot in. But Schultz is he crowds people and then he throws the low kick, and from almost too close in, because one of the benefits of the low kick is that it's quite a long weapon. You can use it. You low kick and then you try and get in after it with your hands, but you can low kick naked because you're a little bit further out than if you were trying to chop down on the thigh. But he does it from really close in, and then he's really good at throwing the left hook or even the right hook. He does it southpaw sometimes, but throwing the hook with the lead hand as his leg is going back behind him, and he cracked a few guys with that as a counter. Really good in the clinch, hits some lovely throws. Very good at what James Krause calls the DC2, which is where you that body lock along the fence where you put your hip inside and you throw them forward onto their hands, which we'll be talking more about with the ACA lads in a minute. But actually, I'll probably review that in a bit. The James Krause cage wrestling course is pretty good. But Schultz had a great little fight with Ramsey Nijem. He came out, he threw the low kick naked. Randy Nijem punched him in the face and he fell on his ass. Randy Nijem jumps on him, starts looking for a guillotine from the top of half guard, and within moments of being dropped and almost being choked, Schultz shoves him off, gets up, and then he's on Nijem's back along the fence and applying the rear naked choke. He's the polar opposite of Lance Palmer in that his fights are actually fucking interesting. I suppose it's because he doesn't actually, he gets in trouble a bit more than Lance Palmer does. But I think and the other thing that I was going to say is that he does a lot of push kicking with his lead leg. So he's a Muay Thai striker, as someone was saying about John Jones this week. People just going in on this lad because he was like, yeah, Izzy's a glory kickboxer, but John Jones is a Muay Thai striker. And Schultz's last one, which, given the climate of things, is all the way back in December, was against Loic Radzhabov. And Radzhabov was good when I saw him. He was good fun in the tournament. But this fight was a banger, an absolute war. 5 rounds of them just cracking each other and wrestling at a great pace. And the Aliev fight is well worth your time too. I haven't watched his first tournament run, which I've heard was a bit more boring, and he got a controversial decision over Chris Wade. But yeah, the lad's looking really good. He would be a welcome addition to the UFC lightweight division, and that's one of the things about the lightweight division in the UFC is that you can really just see. Certainly, it's overflowing with talent, but because of that, it also means that there's so many guys outside the UFC who either lost a couple in the UFC and dropped out and then got, bounced back and are looking even better, or have not been to the UFC yet. There are so many guys who you could just comfortably slot in, and they'd have great fights there. And And I thought Aliev was one, and then Schultz beat him. So yeah, good stuff. Who else is on this? Ryzin's Tafik Musayev is another a guy who, again, hasn't fought in a while, because he was having some contract negotiations with Ryzen that were sort of dragged, because they lost Manel Cape when he was the champion, and Jiri when he was the champion, so it looked like they were going to lose a third champion. But apparently he's happy there, and he's going to continue with them. But the first I'd seen of him, well, actually I think I'd seen him before this, because I watched most of Darren Cruikshank's fights, and he beat Darren Cruikshank at Ryzen 16. But in the Ryzen lightweight tournament, he won that. But Patricky Pitbull was put in by Scott Coker as the worst Pitbull brother, but hopefully going to win that. You know, he was one of the big names, one of the few big names in that tournament, because they also had like the ghost of Kawajiri in there. So Kawajiri meets Pitbull, and Pitbull just flying knees him into a coma. You know, the disgusting shit that you hate about both Japanese MMA and Scott Coker's favourite tactics. But Pitbull met Tafik Musayev in the final, and Musayev just ran him ragged. I mean, he's got very weird striking that's more game than anything. You know, he's just, he's like a lot of Eastern Bloc MMA fighters who are very, very good. They tend to be very, very good because of their wrestling, but back it up by being game as fuck and wild in their striking. But he was doing like sweep singles, coming up with the leg and kicking out the other leg. He was just all over Pitbull, who has done all right against decent wrestlers in Bellator. So a very fun guy who's definitely worth your time. Little bit trickier to find footage of him in Ryzen. And to be honest, a little bit disappointed that he is happy in Ryzen, because it would be really nice to see him in either the UFC or I suppose even Bellator. Honestly, I think any wrestler is getting partly gypped if they're choosing to fight in the ring anyway, because you're giving the guy the free elbow over the ropes takedown defense, which still works. I believe Pitbull grabbed the ropes a good amount in their fight too. But, you know, and you're giving the guy the chance to stick his head under the ropes to avoid damage, and the refs take forever to restart the fight if that happens. Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, Musayev is a guy who you really want to keep an eye on, but also bear in mind that he's fighting under a weird rule set. But he's good, really good. Martin Nguyen from One, you know, we talked about him quite a bit a little while back. I wrote something about him for the Patreon boys. I'll link it in the description. But just a really interesting, sort of a real specialist in that he just landed this one winging overhand. And this is something that we talked about with Prince Nazim and so on. A lot of these smaller guys who get reputation for legendary punching power, when you're in the lighter weight classes, you have to find ways to put your weight into the punch. And sometimes that means like loading up a bit. Other times that means stepping with it. Prince Nazim used to jump with half his punches. But Martin Nguyen he'll throw this like Vince Carter windmill overhand and really step deep with it, throw his whole body weight into it. The one he knocked out Gafarov with was amazing. Inside low kick, he took the inside low kick and he timed the overhand, and the guy went face down unconscious. Just brilliant. His fight with Christian Lee, his two fights with Christian Lee were good. Does this occasional switching into southpaw and can throw a decent left hand off his southpaw stance, which he stunned Christian Lee with in their second fight. I keep forgetting what division Christian Lee's in. I believe he's welterweight at the moment. I can't remember, but he's not on this list anyway. But yeah, the last two of Nguyen's, he added a really nice low kick when he was fighting Jadamba, and used that to set up a beautiful pedalo flying knee, bicycle knee, whatever you want to call it, for the knockout. And then he fought in August. So, you know, he's been out of action for like a year and a couple of months now. So yeah, kind of feels like his career has just petered out, sort of, but hopefully back in business soon. But again, we talked about him before. If you're into guys who throw all their weight into every punch, and sometimes can't land for a full fight, and other times just knock people out in one punch, he's your guy. I'll skip over Mason Jones because, again, I haven't watched much of him. But the other one I've been watching the last couple of days is ACA's Abdul Aziz Abdulvakabov. I really am not going to be able to say that name very well anytime I say it, but he's really interesting. Honestly, when I saw him originally, I thought Amish looking Justin Gaethje, or Amish looking Justin Gaethje when he was fun looking motherfucker. Has this very square stance with his right hand where he's just winging wide rights the entire time at the guy's head. But really strong grappler. He had a great fight with Brian Foster, who I think also fought Justin Gaethje, but throws him down, goes for an over-under pass, which you don't see an awful lot in MMA. over under on the legs. Uses that to pull himself up into half guard like Murillo Santana loves to do. But while he's working the over-under pass, Brian Foster's reaching for like a Kimura or something. And as he consolidates the half guard, he just smashes his shoulder pressure into Foster and slides up to lock in an arm triangle. Really nice stuff. And just a cool use of the over-under pass to get to a consolidated half guard, because that's something that, the guy should be fighting life and death not to give up. Actually, returning to that James Krause instructional I was watching over the week, it was interesting to hear him voice a principle that you see a lot in MMA nowadays. But, Randy Couture was big on turking the leg, as they used to call it, but putting yourself in half guard. And I've been watching a load of Matt Lindland this week, and he does that too. But a lot of BJJ coaches for MMA now don't like you passing to side control, because they believe the guy will turn to his knees and run. Krause said the same thing, like try to land in non-athletic positions, like the half guard, because the half guard you are locked to the dude. You've got one of his legs trapped with one of your legs. He's got one of your legs trapped with one of his legs, but at least he's not going to roll and just spin away. But yeah, I was watching Abdul Aziz Abdulvakabov's pair of fights with Edward Vartanian, who again, Dominic on my timeline is always on about this lad. But really fun fights. In the first one, he beat him in the first round, but they had a rematch in 2017, and it's surreal because Big John McCarthy is reffing ththese fights in Moscow, and everyone else is speaking Russian. The commentators speaking Russian, and he's just there going, "Fighter, do you understand? Do you understand?" But yeah, it was a split decision. It was 5 rounds, absolute war, and honestly, like, Abdulvakabov was winning the first 2 rounds, I thought, by grappling. He's slinging this dude around. And then Vartanian just pours it on later on with striking combinations into standing knees, which are working really well. He's catching him in the head with standing knees. But just another thing that I got from watching some of Abdulvakabov's fights is that he's another one like Arman Sarukian, who does not give a fuck about the guillotine. Like, you see it with Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov's students. He teaches the high crotch, but more like a head outside single. So you're doing like the run the pipe, pull it up, inside trip sort of stuff. But the danger with that is you're getting guillotined. But he's like, I'd rather fight off a guillotine or fight with a guillotine than dive onto a knee or an uppercut on the other side. And you see Habib do that all the time. He'll head fake as if he's going to enter, and then he'll throw his head way out to the side and pick up the single leg, or high crotch rather. But yeah, I've seen Arman Sarukian and Abdulvakabov, both of them from bottom position will come up on a single with their head outside, which is like asking to be crucifixed or guillotined. And they just stand up and they're like, nah, no bother. These dudes with these massive necks and thick backs just being like, sorry, guillotine? I'm unfamiliar with that submission. Do you mean a head squeeze? So yeah, I mean, I can't really give you much detail in depth on these lads because I'm still having a look at them. I might do some stuff on them later in the month or just at a later date. But I thought it was interesting, just like the number of quality fighters, and even in like the course of looking at, say, Natan Schultz record, you find Aliyev, Radzhabov, Rashid Magomedov, really good fighters that you wouldn't have heard of if you were just following the UFC and Bellator. And on Abdulvakabov's record, you got Edward Vartanian, Ali Bagov, amazing fighter at welterweight. And for a long time, like, that was people's argument against Habib having his record padded, because Habib did have his record padded. Until he got to the UFC, he fought an awful lot of guys who, even if their records weren't terrible, they weren't at the point where they should be in with some, like, 12-0 monster. And so, like, Ali Bagov at 2-1 fought a 7-0 Habib Nurmagomedov. But Ali Bagov went on to be this wrecking machine. So yeah, I mean, really more just rambling about cool stuff you find if you go on YouTube and search for some of these lightweight names. But again, like, plug for Michael Fidel and his MMA Prospect Watch, and just all the interesting stuff you can find if you just have a little look outside the UFC. But hopefully that gives you some stuff you can watch in the meantime, while we're waiting for this event to hopefully not be garbage, in spite of all indications. But yeah, I thought that I'd just get there, have a little chat, and we'll be back to programming as normal on Monday. If you haven't read the Israel Adesanya versus Paulo Costa post-fight breakdown, went into a lot of detail, dusted off the old Hemingway typewriter and wrote properly instead of just talking bollocks in my colloquial way as I do on the podcast. And I think you'll enjoy it. So if you're not a Patreon boy and you want to read that, become a Patreon boy. If you are a Patreon boy, what you doing? Get over there and read it. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonbypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack, and I'll catch you later. Cheers.